India-China relations, India-US relations. How did they get to where they are today, and where are they going, maybe? To discuss, I have Raja Mohan, columnist at the Indian Express and researcher at NUS, as well as the inestimable James Crabtree, author of, among many other things, The Billionaire Raj, a book I wish was written about China as well. We'll have to wait for someone to take that on. Raja and James, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Great to be
Great,
here.
great to be here. Yeah.
All right, Raja, a deep history of India-China relations. Start wherever you want to.
Yeah, it starts about 100 years ago at the anti-imperialist Congress in Brussels. I mean, talking about the modern history, not going back deep in. When the national movement of India and the Chinese nationalists came to Brussels to be at the anti-imperialist Congress. And they had this great dream that they're going to work together to overthrow imperialism, build a post imperial Asia, which will be very different. What is the story of the last 100 years is the dream has proved to be elusive. That they've never been able to work together consistently against the West, though that is the declared policy. So both sides found it when US had good relations with China, India did not have good relations with China. When China and India had good relations, they didn't have good relations with the US. So I think what you had was really the dream of building Asian unity against the West was just a dream, because the internal conflicts within Asia are deep and territorial and a whole range of others. So this notion that there is something anti-West or non-West out there, which has been there, this debate has been there for 100 years. But Asia has never been able to unite against the West, because even when they were fighting imperialism, you had Chinese were fighting the Japanese and the Indians were fighting the Brits. So they couldn't even agree, though this great declaration of working against imperialism. In the interwar period, China wanted India to work with them against the Japanese, while India said, no, let's fight the British first. So it was never easy to build that unity. And I think the dream of coming together, but the inability to do so for a variety of reasons, is really the story of India and China in their attempt to build a modern international relations.
Well, I'm a little disappointed you didn't start us with Xuanzang and, Buddhism across the Himalayas, but we'll make do. All right, so let's zoom in to the 21st century.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the 21st century, India and China were largely on the same page, trying to build the so-called multipolar world. The Russians had persuaded both of them to join this effort against the United States domination. But yet, within a decade, we saw the tensions between India and China begin to grow. As China became stronger, the border dispute, which had been, kept under control, we saw that breakdown. We had a series of military crises in 2013, 2014, 2017, and 2020. I think the last two crises were quite decisive in convincing India that this notion that we can work together with China to build a multipolar world was not going to be possible. And that India had to come to terms with the Chinese power and the fact that in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, what you had is the Chinese GDP aggregate is almost 5 times bigger than India's. Chinese military spending is 4 times bigger than India's. So to bridge that power gap, which is now staring at India's face, there was no choice other than working with the US and its Asian allies. So that meant revising a worldview that was predicated on building a post-Western order. Now you had to work with the West to deal with Chinese power in Asia. So the 21st century began with the notion of building a multipolar world, a code for bringing down American hegemony, to actually building a multipolar Asia that is balancing a Chinese dominance over Asia.
So Raj, I remember listening to Samir Saran, who's kind of one of your peers, and he said the kind of distinction was that China believes in a multipolar world, but a unipolar East Asia, and India believes the opposite. And I wondered, do you think that sort of sums up the problem in terms of the worldview?
I think you have to see through the Oriental dissimulation, if you will. The fact is, we have for 4 winters, 60,000 troops locked up at 17,000 feet against the Chinese troops. They're almost face to face. So I think how much, whatever the way we speak about, the distribution of power, the fact is it is Chinese power that keeps squeezing India, whether it's on the border, in the subcontinent, in the Indian Ocean. So America is a distant power, as the Chinese classical strategists might say. You balance the near with the help of the far, which is exactly what Deng Xiaoping did to deal with the Russian power by getting closer to the United States. And I think today, what Mr. Modi is doing is exactly the same, to reach out to the US and to be able to balance China. So we are in a Dengist moment in India. I think the parallel extends to India's growth, India's opportunity to work with American capital to build itself up. So across the board, I would say it is an era of partnership with the US. Some may say, or whatever the rhetoric might be, but the fact is the differences between India and China are huge, and the disputes have become bigger, and they become increasingly difficult to manage.
You and I attended a kind of think tank workshop in Singapore not too long ago, where the IISS, the organization I used to work for, brought together a series of Indian scholars and a series of Chinese scholars to talk about, what the problems were between them. And if I were to sort of sum up the gist of that, it was that the Chinese side said, okay, we have this problem on the border, but maybe we can sort of put this to one side and, things will be all right. We'll work on some other things. We don't really have that much of a problem here. Let's not get it out of proportion. And the Indian side said, we absolutely do have a really massive problem here. And, you're not listening to us. And could you sort of, I thought that was a really interesting distinction. Maybe just say a little bit about that in terms of the kind of the way the two sides seem to be talking past each other at the moment.
No, they're not talking past each other, but I think their positions are fundamentally in opposition to each other. As you rightly said, the Chinese are saying, look, yeah, we broke 30 years of agreements, so don't take it too seriously. There's a new reality. Let's keep that border issue aside. Let's get back to trade. Why are you stopping Chinese investments? Why are you stopping us, why are you moving us out of the digital sector? Because India has, kept China out of 5G, out of a whole range of new emerging technology areas. So they're saying, look, that's okay. Border dispute is okay, but let's get back to doing business. India is saying, no, we're not going to do that. Is there a way of breaking out of this? Maybe if after the election, Mr. Modi comes back, Prime Minister Narendra Modi comes back to power for a third term, and if the Chinese think, look, here is a strong prime minister, he's got maybe a couple of years in which we can take a fresh look at this relationship and do a reset if possible. Because I think by grabbing a little bit of land, I think the Chinese have virtually pushed India into the American side. It has pushed India to focus on self-reliance. It's focused India to strengthen its defense and other capabilities. So in many ways, Xi Jinping, what he has done is really to shake India out of its, this rhetorical anti-Western posturing and underestimating the problem in the neighborhood. So India has largely been cured of it, I think. But it'll be open for a deal in which the pressure on India on the borders can reduce. But I don't see them going back to a happy world where the competition in the Indian Ocean, in South Asia, in global forums, it's really expansive. So I don't see how that can be wished away. But they can come to some kind of a modus vivendi. Let's cool the border situation and see where we go with that. And I suppose the Chinese have an opportunity next year, but so far there's no evidence that they want to fundamentally recast their position towards India.
I think we need a little more history. We're in a really weird place today, where you went from sort of Nehru and Mao being kind of like on one side of, the global non-aligned movement or what have you. But you had border disputes back then, and it's kind of been a constant theme, which has really gotten in the way. So, I mean, maybe just kind of reflecting back on the 20th and 21st century, are there roads not traveled? Do you think this like ultimate split moment that we're in was sort of baked into the trajectory of the two countries? Like, what are some different forks in the road, thinking back over those 100 years that you started us on, that really
Yeah.
stick out to you?
So in the interwar period, what we had was a situation where the Japanese imperialism was the problem for China. British imperialism was the problem for India. So while at the Anti-Imperialist League in Brussels, they declared that we will work together for the post-imperial world, they were fighting different imperial powers who were on opposite sides. And this was a problem that much of Asia faced in dealing with the situation, because they were trying to get rid of the European colonialists. Some people were fighting Japanese imperialism in Asia. So you could not work out a common ground. But after independence, we thought we could actually now build whatever happened in the interwar period is fine. We are now all independent. Let's work together to build this new world. But that couldn't be done because of the territorial dispute and the Tibet. We didn't mention Tibet so far. How India and China think about Tibet. Their relationship to Tibet has always been in dispute. But Nehru thought he could put the border dispute aside, try and build a relationship, recognize China when much of the Western world was isolating it, and hope that would lead to a better understanding. But that attempt broke down in the late 50s and the early 1960s. And then we had a 30-year chill in the relationship. But back to the end of the Cold War, then we start all over again. They say, look, we're buddies. I know Russians convinced us, look, America, the big bad evil, is a unipolar moment, hyperpower. Let's all get together to reduce the dangers of a unipolar moment. India thought it was a good idea, even as it began to engage the United States. And this moment where India and China had some kind of a peace on the border, and the relationship was expanding, trade was expanding, but that is broken down, I would say, 10 years ago, when the Chinese power vis-a-vis India had grown so much, and the Chinese believed that the power differential is so high, they can actually dictate the terms on the boundary settlement. But just as they're trying to do it with the neighbors in South China Sea, with Japan, with everyone that picked up a fight, I think the Chinese have calculated there can be no countervailing coalition. We can always deal with the Americans on a bilateral basis, and that the US will not be able to put together a countervailing coalition. But I think India surprised them, I think, by moving closer to the US and willing to join the countervailing coalition in Asia. And what we've seen happen in the last years is really more and more countries are willing to join this coalition, because the Chinese were unwilling to show any generosity or goodwill to its neighbors. For all the talk about community of common destiny, how they treat Philippines or how they dealt with India is a classic case, or even claims on Indonesian waters, which are really 2,000 kilometers away from the Chinese mainland. I think this expansionism and the sense that your neighbors were too weak to come together, and America was in any case in decline, both these assumptions, I think, have turned out to be wrong. The US is doing very well, and is doing pretty well in Asia by putting together this coalition.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of like the Xi rationale of, like, it being worth it to sort of push the issue on, like, a few kilometers in the snow, which, like, I'm pretty sure doesn't have great minerals or anything, it has always sort of surprised me. But I'm curious, I come from a country that hasn't had a border dispute in like 100+ years. What does it do for, like, a body politic when something like this happens? Because we've seen, really dramatic responses, not just in, that have, like, filtered all the way up to, like, double-digit changes in polling numbers and like whole national stances that you just illustrated over the past 15 years. driven, it seems first and foremost by like headlines about border issues. So, it seems very like passe, I guess, in one sense in 2024 for this to be a thing that people focus on. But why do you think border issues still have so much salience today?
At least in Asia, look, we are newly independent countries. We attach great value to territorial nationalism. And the idea that, look, this belongs to us, this is our country, therefore we be willing to fight for it. I mean, that's a common sentiment all across Asia, whether it's China, India, even Japan, Korea, you take it. I mean, I think the number of territorial disputes in Asia is quite enormous. And that is the major difference, I would say, I thought, at least till now, with Europe. But the fact is, Mr. Putin wants more territory, though I don't know why he wants more territory. But the fact is, in a way, whether you call it reconstituting the Russian Empire with all the grievances against what the West has done, or the Chinese claims that, look, the imperial powers took all this away, all this belonged to us, therefore we need to reclaim that. So when we talk to the Chinese, they say, look, this was our land, we're just taking what is ours. Indians would say, sorry, it's not. So I think whenever there was a room in the past under Deng Xiaoping to settle these things, Deng was always wise, who said, look, leave it to the next generation, don't quarrel over this, let's focus on development. I think Xi has really abandoned that line, in a way, raising questions, I think. A lot of people think Chinese stand 10 feet tall, look far, they're kind of wise. But the fact that you picked up quarrel with all your neighbors at the same time says something. I think the level of miscalculation that has gone on in China. But I'm sure professionals in Chinese diplomacy, their foreign office, their strategic community does see that. And one doesn't know when a correction will come, but at some point the correction will come. And at that point, I think there will be room for reset between China and its neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea of like, okay, you can like build national power and you can like spend down national power. And like the net gain that you could have from continuing to have a somewhat functional relationship with India from a sort of economic, commercial, and diplomatic perspective versus like a few kilometers in the Himalayas just always strike me as like there's something deep and psychological going on that I do not really understand.
I mean, maybe let me jump in here. So, I mean, I think it is worth pausing on this because it's the absolute crux of this issue, right? Which is, without India in the Western coalition balancing China, it looks much more flimsy. And so even though there are other things that China has done, the relationship with the Philippines, what have you, India, the relationship with Europe to some degree, the relationship with India really does sort of seem on the surface like a huge strategic miscalculation. But when you think that China has made a strategic miscalculation, it might be that it was just a mistake, but it might be that you just don't understand the incentive system within the CCP and the kind of military hierarchy. So Roger, you've given us an explanation as to why this has happened, which was sort of China made a rational calculation, which is that it felt if it threw its weight around on the border, India wouldn't have many options. And it turned out India actually did have some options. It just had to junk many decades worth of sort of ideological baggage, which it has done with great speed. But there's another sort of account of what happened, which was sort of, it was an accident, as in, the Chinese on the border got involved with a sort of emergent set of behaviors, which sort of got out of control. And the Chinese kind of got backed into a corner, didn't feel they could back down against the weaker party. And so which of these we believe is true, as in this was very deliberate, driven from the top. They were trying to, kind of push the weaker party around, or actually maybe this was a bit more local and tactical and it got out of hand and then they didn't feel they could back down, tells you something. Which of these interpretations you have is important, given your view of sort of how the Chinese state and its military operate. So could you just say a little bit more about that? You seem to have quite a definite view of what had happened, that this was a deliberate kind of miscalculation, but one that had strategic intent. So just unpick that a bit more.
Both the things were true. That is what, for almost 30 years, starting from the late 80s and early 90s, we didn't settle the boundary dispute, but we had established a set of rules to to manage peace and tranquility on the border. One of the main agreements was that you don't move large number of troops close to the border. And if you do any kind of exercise, you inform the other side. So therefore, that gave a sense of stability to the border. So what happened in 2020 summer was the Chinese suddenly moved a large number of troops close to the Indian border. That was a surprise for India at the beginning of the pandemic. So India had to respond. India deployed its own troops. So therefore, that China broke 3 decades of agreements is not in doubt. So India responds. That comes to the third bullet point. Stuff happens when you put so many troops together. It did happen. It is probably what happened in Galwan Valley, which saw a number of Indian soldiers and some Chinese soldiers die in a physical clash. That, I think, exacerbated the situation. That is, maybe you could say there was a room to have managed the situation if this violence had not taken place, because these were the first deaths on the border in nearly 50 years. So I think the death of the Indian soldiers then made it harder to walk back for either side, and it makes it harder. That doesn't take away, the accident does not take away from the fact that there is asymmetry of power between China and India. And what China was been doing on our border, basically salami slicing, pushing closer, edging, on the dance on the border with your military, thanks to the modernization of infrastructure in Tibet. This is exactly what they've been doing in South China Sea. So it's not something that they were doing here, that the sense that the moment had come, time to redeem the historical claims. They always had those claims, and I think they're trying to redeem it. Now the problem for sea is how do you walk back from this?
Yeah, and I think the other sort of data point you have, right, is like, this is 4 years ago now. And if you wanted to sort of, do olive branches or whatever, like, yeah, there's been plenty of opportunities to do that. But I think what you've seen over the past 4 years, correct me if I'm wrong, is just, more build up, more new roads, more new bases. This hasn't been there has been no explicit or tacit showing of like, hey, let's just, forget about this for a decade and see if we can get some Huawei sold in India again.
So I think what's happened is really we had almost 21 rounds of military talks. I mean, that's only talks that are going on. Because at one point, the troops were really, even with tanks up there, barely 100 meters away from each other, ready to fire. So both sides agreed that, look, let's begin with the disengagement. The troops were too close for their own good. Second, we will kind of de-escalate. That is, move them a little further away from the line of contact. And then actually what is called de-induction, take the troops back to their peacetime location. So a 3-phase settlement on a number of friction points, which are, say, there are about 7 friction points. So what we've done in the last 4 years is really we have kind of disengaged at 5 of the 7 points. So they at least moved away from each other, but we're a long way from de-escalation and de-induction. But the fact is, the bulk of the deployments made in 2020 are still there, and there's been no movement in the direction. Meanwhile, the modernization of Chinese infrastructure in Tibet and the Indian response to it has meant that what was a disputed border, but it was not a militarized border for all these years, because neither side had really built a massive infrastructure on the Indo-Tibetan border. But I think that has changed because the PLA modernizing the infrastructure in Tibet, once they did it, India had to follow suit. So because both the militaries now operate close to the border, because they have the capacity to do so, that makes the likelihood of a conflict more. And if you're negotiating, the pressure to establish claims has also grown. So therefore, I think we're at the worst possible situation. And it's really now, much of the focus has been in eastern Ladakh, in the northwestern part of the border, that is between Kashmir state and Tibet. But I think we're almost in a permanent military confrontation all along the 4,000 kilometers of frontier between India and China. And unless you make some really big moves, to go back and say, look, peace and tranquility is not enough. We got to do a deal. We got to settle this boundary. Otherwise, you're just going to keep this going like this. So that's where we are. I think at some point, we'll have both sides. We'll have to say, look, is this good for us? It's not good for either one of us. But the fact is, since India thinks, as the Chinese proverb goes, he who tied the knot must untie it. So we're waiting for the Chinese to start untying it.
I'm normally based in Singapore, as you know, but I was in Beijing last week. I saw the Indian ambassador there and sort of had a chat with him about how things were going, and without betraying any confidences, there didn't appear to be anything particularly moving in the relationship. But then, to bring us right back up to date, Prime Minister Modi within the last week made a statement sort of saying that relations should be improved in one form or another. I wondered, do you have a sense of what was going on there? I mean, was this a pre-election signal, or did it relate to something that was going on the border? Often when, prime ministers make these statements, there's something lurking beneath, and it sort of slightly surprised me because it popped out of left field.
James, you and I have been newspaper journalists, editors. How the headline gets drawn, always creates an impression which is not necessarily true, because the whole way it was played out was, oh my God, there's a change in Indian position. I don't think Mr. Modi was signaling a change in position, but the way he was presenting it was somewhat different from the way the Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been presenting last 3-4 years, which is, look, the state of the border will decide the state of the relationship. That is, unless you move on the border, the rest of the process can't move. What Mr. Modi flipped it around and said, look, we like you, we want a good relationship, but why don't you fix the border? So I think he was putting the problem more positively. And I think essentially probably exploring, I think if he comes back strongly, and to see, look, there is a strong prime minister in India, and if Xi Jinping wants to explore, look to seize the moment, to see if there's a way we can go forward. I think they were creating the space for that, my sense is. So it depends on now, next 3 months, nothing is likely to happen. Once Indian elections are over and your government is in place, I think that could be a moment where there could be some attempt at saying, look, let's at least take a fresh look. And it can only be done now at the highest political level. There was a brief attempt, Jordan, at this BRICS meeting in South Africa last year. And the two leaders were present. There was intense negotiations actually going on the border. It looked like, some deal could be done, but in the end, it didn't work out. So my sense is, post-election, there could be a moment where to take a fresh political look at the crisis in the bilateral relations.
Let's do a little one-on-one on the sort of India's domestic political situation. How's Modi doing, and what should people be expecting as the 3-month election cycle rolls its course?
If you go by the opinion polls, it looks like he's winning, and winning reasonably big. The expectations last time the BJP got about 303 seats in the lower house of parliament. India is in a Westminster system out of a total of 540. So there might be some increase, but the opposition parties led by Congress are hopeful they can bring down the BJP by a couple of notches at least, if not to deny them a majority. So there is a contest, but I think it is a one-sided contest at this point. And I think problem for many voters after 2 terms of Modi, if they look around for an alternative, there is not a credible alternative. If there was one, perhaps you could have said there could have been a better challenge and the voters would have had a choice. But there is not. There's not been a big choice, and that leaves Mr. Modi as the front runner, well ahead of the opposition. So we'll see him coming back strongly, and I think Mr. Modi is so self-confident that he says my 3rd term before the elections. And he's also telling businessmen, parliamentarians, look, what you've seen so far in the last 10 years is just a trailer. The real movie will begin now. We're going to do big things. We're going to do bold things. There's going to be more reform. There's going to be more transformational change in India. So, in a sense, he is generating much greater expectations for some decisive action in the first 100 days when he takes over. And even before the elections are completed, the wooing of the Western capital has not stopped. Mr. Musk is arriving in Delhi this week, this month. Mr. Musk is arriving in Delhi for what is expected to be closing in on a deal that involves a major investment in producing Tesla EVs in India. He's also meeting a large number of Indian space startups because India, in the last 2 years under Modi, has done some privatization. So the two sectors where Musk is a dominant force, space and EVs, on both, Modi's opened up room for collaboration, and my sense is they're going to see a lot of action there. And similarly, on the high-tech stuff, I'll just add one more point. The semiconductor mission, which was started in India, nothing happens in a hurry. But the fact is, since Mr. Modi's visit to Washington in June last year, that's 2023, the determination with which he has pursued the semiconductor mission. So now we have at least 3 major projects on the semiconductor side which have been launched in the last few weeks. So I think things are moving, especially in the high-tech sector, where the connection between India and the US capital is getting stronger by the day.
I mean, I go back to what might happen after the election. Again, being in Beijing, I was there in part doing a launch for the Chinese version of my book on India, which came out quite a long time ago, but the Chinese version only just came out. So we had 200 people in a room at Tsinghua University asking basic questions about India. And always the Chinese audience is sort of interested in, is India going to somehow manage to follow the Chinese path? I thought it was interesting that you said, India is now in a sort of dungest moment. Ruchir Sharma, the investor and sort of author, also wrote a column for the FT saying India is becoming more East Asian, as in more autocratic in its leadership, but also more successful economically in terms of manufacturing and technology. Is that what you think we can expect after the election? I mean, what do you think Modi's assuming it is Modi, what is his third term priority going to be? And is India gradually moving, dare one say, in a sort of slightly more Chinese direction?
Yes and no. I mean, what the yes part is this. I think post-independence, what India did was something completely different from what Northeast Asia did, what Southeast Asia did. Northeast Asia focused on building domestic capital, gain access to American market, be a strategic partner for the US, and build itself up. That is the Japanese and the Koreans. That's what they did. The Southeast Asians opened themselves to foreign capital, gained access to the Western markets, brought in Western capital to produce cheap goods, and an export-led growth seen them prosper. For almost 65, 70 years, what India did was something in between, which is we kept our domestic capital down in the name of socialism, and we kept the foreign capital out, saying that, look, we don't need imperialism and imperialist money within India. So the worst possible outcome was the building up of a bureaucratic, semi-capitalist, semi-socialist state, which was disastrous for India. And I think what we've seen under Mr. Modi is really the first prime minister who is explicitly pro-capital. He's saying that, look, it is capital that creates jobs. We need more jobs. We need a bigger economy. Therefore, I'm going to let the animal spirits of Indian capitalism unfold. And what he's saying, unlike Indira Gandhi, who said, look, we don't need foreign capital in the name of self-reliance. What Mr. Modi is saying, I want more production in India. Western capital is welcome. Come and produce in India and produce for the world. So it's more open to the Western capital in a way that we were not before. And it's also open to domestic capital, which is what the Gilded Age, you can talk about crony capitalism. But the fact is, Indian capital is thriving, and for the first time in the last 75 years. And I think that is the direction. So in a way, strengthening domestic capital, in that sense, we are close to East Asia. But my sense is all the East Asian democratic model or authoritarian model, I would say India is too big, too diverse, to, you know, fundamentally constituted by a number of religions, number of castes, a number of communities, at least 25 languages. I think we are democratic by structure, not by upholding some kind of a liberal a priori principles, because there's no other way, I think, of ruling India, that even Mr. Modi had to reach out a large number of lower caste groups, because originally the BJP was an upper caste Hindu party. So I think there is a transformation going on. And I think the very logic of staying in power and getting at least 40% of the vote would depend on building wider coalitions. And I don't think that fundamental proposition has disappeared. While you can say, look, there is abuse of state power, there is domination by, current government, but I don't think the domination is hegemony. I don't think it is systemic, and my sense is that the Indian diversity will continue to keep us democratic.
So, Roger, let me come back to this issue of the relationship between India and the US and India and China. I mean, in a sense, this is what the kind of international story comes back to. Do you see after the election that, you did speculate a little bit earlier about the possibility of a kind of subtle rapprochement between India and China, but your sort of central scenario is that the deepening relationship between India and the US, whoever wins, sort of Trump or Biden, maybe you could talk a little bit about that as well, sort of, whichever way the US goes, does this head in the same direction? But assuming Modi wins, is kind of deeper relations between India and the West, with America, with the Europeans, with Japan and Australia, is that the kind of central scenario? That's where we're heading, as in, it'll be like this and continue to be like this?
On China, I mean, rapprochement is too much of a strong word. I think if you're lucky, we'll get some relaxation of tensions. I don't know, détente was the right word for it. Maybe we can cool the tensions, pull back our troops from there. But rapprochement too strong, given the depth and intensity and the range of contradictions that BW has. But with the US, what we've seen happen over the last 20 years, the trajectory has been up and up, irrespective of the administrations in Washington and within India. I mean, even before Mr. Modi, over the last 20 years, I mean, the attempt to build a new relationship with the US, I think there is a strong consensus on both sides. And my sense is that will continue. And the more subjects that we bring in for collaboration, for example, as I said, look, the tech sector, India was part of the sanctions regime because of the nuclear proliferation related issues. Once George W. Bush broke out of it, conditions were created for reviving India-US technological collaboration. We see that now unfolding under the so-called Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies. When India shed its, let's keep the West out of Indian Ocean and say, look, let's balance the Chinese, that has opened space for the Indian Navy to work with the US Navy, European navies, and the Japanese and the Australians to say that India today, we got almost 21 ships in the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of the Arabian Sea today, actually undertaking maritime security role. So I think what you have is really the range of collaborations is expanding, and irrespective of which administration is in power in Washington. My sense is this trajectory will continue to grow, both on trade, on technological collaboration, defense and strategic collaboration. On trade, of course, if Trump comes, Trump, of course, sees India as a tariff king. There will be some issues in terms of how to manage it. If India is smart, it will prepare for that eventuality and say, look, we got to find a way with dealing the promise of Trump for a 10% tariff across the board on all imports and, of course, 60% against the Chinese goods. But I think India needs to show it's a little more trade-friendly. James, you know the subject quite well. We've not been user-friendly when it comes to trade agreements. But I think if we want our trade with the US to grow, we have to start to rethink, because India-US trade is the largest today. It's about $200 billion, the biggest trade relationship that we have. And our government will move on. A second issue is immigration. The fact that there are 5 million Indians today in the US, you could say Trump, will he crack down on that issue? My own sense is that any immigration policy reform in the US would still involve bringing technical talent. And I think that's where Indian advantage is. And my sense is that issue too will be can be managed. Then on the Russia question, I think is a problem. If things get worse in the next few years, how do we reconcile our differences in Russia? Will be an issue. But then, as I keep telling my European and American friends, India is less of a problem in Ukraine than the Republican Party is. So what happens in the US, what happens in Europe with the Germans is far more consequential, because I don't see India is not so attached to Russia that it would squander its expanding relationship with the US and Europe. So the question for India is, how do I manage the path dependence, if you will, of the legacy issues where our relationship with Russia has left a large dependence on Russian weapons. And if that changes, I think my sense is it's going to be a different one. Already you see India's not buying too many weapons from Russia, new weapon systems. It is also trying to produce a lot more spares within India. And the whole focus on getting Western capital to produce weapons in India, we're starting to see some progress. So I would say the Russian factor is beginning to decline in India's overall international relationship. The only way it remains relevant, I think, takes you back to the China question. That is, if you want really a coalition against China, can you do without Russia? Is having Russia neutral or on your side is an important one. But then, unfortunately for us, for Europeans and for the Americans, squaring the Russian and the Chinese questions has become hard. India sees China as a problem, Russia is a friend. For Europe, China is a friend, Russia is a problem, and the Republicans and Democrats seem to have the same issue. Where do you focus?
So as the European in the room, I should point out that actually India's largest trading partner is no longer the United States. It is now the European Union and has been for 2 years. But just talk a little bit, let's sort of just test this a little bit. So the most read article about India in the West last year anyway was Ashley Tellis's piece in Foreign Affairs that had the headline, "America's Bad Bet on India." And the gist of that was that for a long time, the United States had what Ashley himself used to call a kind of policy of strategic altruism towards India, where sort of anything that was good for India was good for the United States. But in this piece, he was saying, don't expect India to come and help with Taiwan, for instance. And you can see a number of other potential sort of pain points in the relationship. You mentioned Russia. We haven't talked about India's alleged assassination of Sikh separatists in Canada. And you can also look at what people call democratic backsliding domestically, namely what the data suggests is an erosion of some of India's democratic institutions and its treatment of minorities under the current government. So if you sort of put all that together, is there a case to say that the foundation of the India-US relationship has a few more cracks in it than maybe we might think?
Look, I would say Ashley Tellis was really, one of the early pioneers in thinking about the relationship differently, and pushed many new ideas that have got established. But like all of us individuals, that once ideas are adopted, they're no longer yours. That you can't suddenly come and say, look, let's change course. Because I think what's happened in the last 20 years is the two bureaucracies have moved forward. You unleash these massive, gigantic machines of two large countries to start working together. So what do the Americans say? The train has left the station. So this notion that you can simply halt it because India won't work with you on Taiwan or India's democratic backsliding, I don't think that works politically. So let me explain. I think on the Taiwan question, this notion that, look, I'm sure in Australia, in Japan, Philippines, everywhere, there are more than one view that everyone is not going to suddenly stand up and jump if there is a war between China and Taiwan. Everyone is going to simply rally to the cause of Taiwan. Most countries are divided. And I think this notion that India is somehow the problem on Taiwan is fundamentally wrong. Second, I don't think the US is expecting India to sail its ships into the Taiwan Strait when the confrontation comes. And my sense is what we're looking at is some kind of a burden sharing in which India can take more responsibilities in Eastern Indian Ocean, facilitate the US to concentrate on the Taiwan Straits, to facilitate the movement of US troops. So the ways in which India can help without having to put boots on the ground or ships on the water in the Taiwan Strait. So I think we are looking at practical ways in which we can cooperate rather than saying, tell me now, are you going to show up in the Taiwan Strait? I don't think
And
Japanese, let me finish. I don't think the Japanese are going to say yes to that. Australia is going to say yes to that. We will show up with you. So I think India will work because I think there is a new realization in Delhi that a Taiwan contingency is also an Indian contingency, because if Taiwan goes under, the Himalayas are the next. That is the biggest dispute that China has. So therefore, we're no longer seeing Taiwan as a distant conflict, and that the outcome in Taiwan matters to us. Therefore, it's not as if India is going to simply be a bystander. Second, with all respect to my friends in the US, I follow US history, US foreign policies history. This notion that US only supports democracies is kind of shocking to me. That in my life experience in Asia, if US could do business with China for 40 years, I don't see why they won't do business with Modi's India. If they could love the Pakistani military for 70 years, I don't see a somewhat backsliding, what's on the face India would be untouchable. So I think there is a US domestic ideological discourse about democracy. But that has nothing to do with the US history of US policy, which has been pragmatic to pursue interests. But there will always be groups within the US Congress, within the US establishment, will keep raising questions. But I think the direction of US policy has been, when it comes to the tension between values and interests, interests will prevail. We've seen that in the case of Saudi Arabia, in the case of MBS, how the US had to deal with it. So I'm not really worried as if the democracy argument is a deal breaker between India and the US. In any case, that doesn't mean, for me as a liberal at home, we'll have to fight those battles. A bunch of Americans talking about it and saying, we will kind of not do business with India is neither here nor there.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. If you look at the partners in the free and open Indo-Pacific, it does include Vietnam. So if you can be friends with a Leninist communist regime when the mood takes you, then I think Modi should be no great problem. Just to kind of connect the dots on where China fits into the India picture, we haven't talked that much about the Indian Ocean. And so that's the other big theater. The Himalayas are obviously the kind of principal source of conflict, but actually India, is almost equally exercised by China's incursion in the Indian Ocean. And that happens in lots of different ways. Submarines pop up in Sri Lanka. China suddenly becomes quite friendly with countries on India's periphery, like the Maldives at the moment. And say a little bit more about that. And in a sense, what do you think China is trying to do in the Indian Ocean, and how is India responding? Because as China becomes an ever bigger power with a larger sense of its strategic interest, then once you've got past Southeast Asia, then the Indian Ocean is really your next sort of theater for China. And so that's where the two sort of Asian superpowers are kind of butting heads in the second area, as opposed to just up in the mountains.
No, exactly. I think historically, we thought about China facing the Western Pacific, India facing Indian Ocean. So the orientation of maritime did not really have a direct bearing, so that we could really live with each one doing its own thing in the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. I think the rise of China as a great trading power has also helped fuse the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. That China has resources, it needs resources from the Middle East, from Africa, and that China would not going to be satisfied by remaining merely a Pacific power, but it wants to be a player in the Indian Ocean. Just as if the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Americans would come to the Indian Ocean as age of capitalism dawned, why wouldn't the second largest economy show up in the Indian Ocean? As a large trading state, China is building a large navy. That again is not a shocking outcome. And it's a matter of time. They are going to be a big force in the Indian Ocean. as they build more aircraft carriers. They have the first base today in Djibouti. They're looking for facilities, dual-use arrangements all across the Indian Ocean littoral. So if you're looking at in a longer view, they will be here. Maybe India has about 10 years to come up with a strategy in which we can at least secure our interests. And any such strategy on the Indian Ocean would involve cooperation with the Americans, with the Quad, even as India builds up its own capabilities and shares the burden of managing the Indian Ocean dynamic, not only with the US, but with France, is also a resident Indian Ocean power, which is exactly what we're doing, which is to, after years of saying European imperialists stay out of Indian Ocean, American imperialists stay out of the Indian Ocean. Today, Mr. Modi says, you're welcome. Let's all work together for the, what is it, rules-based international order and a good maritime behavior in the region. And that's the reason why today, and here is a problem for India. The problem for India is that much of its defense resources go to the continental realm to defend the land frontiers against Pakistan and China. But it cannot devote more than 17-18% of its defense budget to Navy. So even though the Indian Navy is pretty large, is the fourth largest in the world, there, I think it needs to have a coalition strategy if it wants to be effective. So the naval side, as China becomes a major power, the coalition strategy becomes more and more important for India. And for the US too, sharing this burden with India, helping India take larger responsibilities, boosting Indian capabilities on the maritime side is also helpful. So I think that's where we are. The Quad is really about a maritime coalition. And my sense is as Chinese naval power grows, this coalition will also get deeper and deeper in terms of the kind of things that it does.
Okay, you mentioned the Quad. Let's do a I don't know, give Biden and multilateral diplomacy in South Asia a grade.
I would go as maybe A minus at least, because in 2020 nobody believed you could really bring all these guys together. Because if James knows, I was living in Singapore along with James. This notion America was on decline, it's all going to be happily living under the Chinese hegemony in this part of the world, and this idea that our friends in Southeast Asia like Kishore Mahbubani was saying, look, the story is over. China has won, and the West was incompetent to be able to do anything. What we've seen happen, I think, is really by simply showing up. James knows, he was the director of ISS Asia. The amount of time Biden administration has spent sheerly in terms of showing up, high-level engagement with the region, expanding cooperation with Japan, with South Korea, with India, with Australia, with Philippines, with Vietnam. And I think the Americans, given the resources, if they put their mind to it, with all the other chaos that happens, I think people were looking for an alternative, not for a US that says, we're going to simply cede and leave. But the moment the US says, no, we're going to be around, we're going to stand up to Chinese domination, I think a lot of Asian countries would take that opportunity, because that increases our leverage, our negotiating capabilities. So I think things have changed. This idea, of course, popular in the Biden administration, which Jake Sullivan, this notion of a lattice work. I think here again, what the US has done is to look beyond mere bilateral alliances to one, building partnerships with countries that are not going to be allies, like India or Indonesia, and at the same time encourage partnerships between the allies and the partners. That is, moving from a hub and spokes model, which was a post-war construct that the US had developed in Asia, to a networked security where many of the regional powers will come together and work together to provide an architecture in which Chinese power can be balanced. And I think that scheme of a lattice work, the scheme of building a coalition where the US actually, unlike in Europe, can back countries that are willing to stand up. While Europeans say, look, Americans do everything, today Japan is saying, look, it's willing to take larger burden. India has its own great power aspirations. So therefore it says, look, I'm going to contribute. So at least some countries in Asia are not passive partners on the NATO train. They're willing to do things for their own interests, not because America wants it, because they have nationalist problems with China. So I think the US is on a good wicket. If they continue these policies under the next term, you might see much stronger consolidation. And meanwhile, this notion that the West is in decline or the US is in decline, we see the date at which China might overtake the US is being postponed, probably indefinitely. The US is today, I think, coming back on the economic side. And the share of China and as well as Eurozone as percentage of US GDP is declining. So here you have the top 5 tech companies, Jordan, have a GDP which is bigger than certainly India's, almost close to Japan's. So here you are, I think the kind of resources the US can actually deploy if there is political will is massive. And I think we've seen some demonstration of that in the last few years. And my sense is the US weight, if the technological revolution continues to unfold, the US weight will continue to grow relative to Europe and China. And I think that's going to make it much more interesting in the region rather than this notion of a predictable, elegant American decline and a joyful China's rise. I think that scenario is no longer with us.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting kind of reflecting back on the 4 years of Biden Asia policy, because on the one hand they got dealt like a pretty good hand with, you know, the macro factors of slowing Chinese growth, accelerating American growth, and then, you know, China being obnoxious in all these borders, but the sort of, you know, what it took to go from that like latent opportunity to getting everyone to sit down and have all these agreements, I think is the kind of key alpha there, I guess, that the Biden administration can claim. You mentioned tech. How did ChatGPT land in India? Are people excited, scared about our, you know, AI future?
No, I think we're loving it, as the Americans say. That Indians are, you know, we have always had the elite was very tech oriented, and you know, if you go back to right from the 1940s, the idea that look, technology was the kind of thing that was going to bind India and the US, and therefore India, actually the first reactor in Asia was built in India by General Electric in the 1960s. The first satellites in Asia were built for India by Ford Aerospace. You know, it no longer exists. So the notion that look, India and US can work together in technology is a deeply held one. But I think the politics were never in synergy. But today, what you're seeing is really the coming together of India's large technical pool of talent and the natural connections with Silicon Valley, that have organic connections that have evolved over the last 3-4 decades. Today, they're in full force. In fact, the difference between India and the US at the state level is this. Americans say danger, danger, danger. Let's limit it. That's the Biden administration. I don't know if the Trump's people will say the same thing. India is saying, no, we want to use it for development. We want to use it for a lot of new ways in which it can be used to transform India, accelerate India's development. So at the Bletchley conference on AI, for example, I mean, the Western proposition was tamper it down, you know, find guardrails. Well, India is saying, no, we need it more. And I think what we've seen happen is really some of India's enthusiasm has become infectious. I mean, I think recently Satya Nadella's visit to India, where a lot of Indian innovation, for example, we have 25 languages. Are they trying to, you know, use the Indian diversity to create, you know, structures which are going to be very helpful in thinking through the next stage of AI and chat GPT development. So I think we're fully on board. And my sense is with the semiconductor mission, with NVIDIA now promising India it'll hand over some, the chips, the special chips. We are, I think, at a very important moment, and I think that's what the so-called critical and emerging technologies initiative between India and the US at the formal level, but it's really the huge surge of collaborations between Indian startup ecosystem, the American Silicon Valley capital. Maybe something, maybe Jordan and James, both of you know that how the American venture capital and American capital helped boost the Chinese tech sector. For all the talk about Chinese tech sector's growth, I mean, it was American VCs really helped fund that whole advances. Today, I think something similar is beginning to happen. And the old kind of constraints on technology collaborations have gone. And the logic of money and business is actually going to propel us closer to each other, and that is India and the US in the tech sector. So I would say on semiconductors, on space, on the use of digital public infrastructure, I think we're really coming together in a big way. So I would say that it's the beginning of a beautiful relationship, I might say.
Yeah, like AI diffusion has been a big theme of ChinaTalk over the past few years, and the idea that like developed countries will be too scared to take the plunge while the developing ones see more upside and ultimately kind of like gain more from these technologies is something definitely we'll be following in the years to come. Raja, let's close with some book recommendations. What do you think ChinaTalk listeners should be reading to upgrade their understanding of India?
I don't know if there's one book, James, you can think of a book you can tell me what to recommend. Yeah.
There's an excellent book about the rise of billionaire capitalists in India. There's a book that's not out yet, actually, this year, Jordan, which I think everyone should read when it comes out, it's called The New India by a journalist called Rahul Bhatia, and it's coming out in a few months' time. And I think I'm very confident this is going to be the big India book of the year. It sort of brings together the story of the rise in big tech in India and the rise of the BJP. And he's a fantastic author and essayist, one of the most talented long-form writers in India. So I think that one will be really worth reading.
I think the Western liberal focus on one set of developments in India, I think is blinding them to the larger social churn that is going on within India. So I would say to understand the rise of the BJP, there is a very good book that has come. It's called The New BJP. In a way, by Dr. Nalin Mehta. What it does, he was also a former colleague at the National University of Singapore. I think there's a lot of data there to show how did the BJP expand its social base? How did it bring a large number of castes which were not traditionally supportive of the BJP into its fold? How has the representation of the lower castes changed in the elected representatives in BJP-dominated states and in the positions of the party hierarchy? So I would certainly recommend that book, The New BJP, to get a sense of this party, which some see as the world's largest party, not excluding Chinese Communist Party, which is really and well organized. And I think that's the other side of it, which is really and using a lot of tech to bring together, to mobilize. So I think this book, The New BJP by Nalin Mehta, does give some insights into the social side of the broader internal coalition that the BJP has built.
If you want to, Jordan, chuck a couple more in, given this is a sort of India-China discussion, then there are two books that jump to mind on that. One is by Tanvi Madan at the Brookings Institution. She wrote a book called The Fateful Triangle, looking at the history of India, China, and the US over the second half of the 20th century. And then when I was in the Indian embassy in Beijing last week, I was looking on the pictures of all of the previous ambassadors, a real array of Indian diplomatic talent who are sent to Beijing. I mean, they really do send their very best to Beijing. It's the most important bilateral relationship, I would say. One of them is a guy called Vijay Gokhale, and he has written 3 books recently on the kind of India-China. One of them is called The Long Game, which is how the Chinese negotiate with India. But all 3 of Vijay Gokhale's books either on the Indian view of China or the Chinese view of India. They're all good. So those would be some good books if people are interested on the sort of interaction of India and China.
The Long Game is certainly a good one in a way. It tells you that question, Jordan, you were asking earlier. I mean, why has we've not been able to solve the problem. It kind of tells you the difference in the negotiating strategies and assumptions, which led to the real crisis today, a deep structural crisis in the relationship.
So I'll just throw one in here. So actually in college, I took one course on India, but the India book that really stuck with me, Ramachandra Guha, India After Gandhi. I have no idea what his, political valence is in today, whether he's canceled or not. But the prose, oh my God, the prose that he's able to squeeze out of these different episodes of, 20th and I guess 21st century Indian history too is just I don't know. Anyone who likes like good history writing, I think should pick it up. But maybe Raja, why don't you just like what is the disclaimer before reading any Guha that people should know before they jump in?
No, I think he's a genuine liberal, and he brings in his very very strong voice, and I think he's kind of his critique of the government is widely accepted. I mean, but not by the most popular at the mass level, but I think the arguments he has made on the state of play in India, I mean, I think it has got strong support, and many issues he's been really ahead of the curve, I would say. But one issue on which I think his view that India should not be a major power. India not only ought not to be, it should not even try to be a great power. I think that also reflects a tradition within India, this self-abnegation, Gandhian tradition of saying, we don't do this kind of stuff. But I think I think the story has moved on. I think India's relative size in the hierarchy, as India's relative size of its economy grows, and as India's position in the hierarchy of the major powers goes up, I think India is on its way to becoming a major power. Just by sheer weight of its economy and the prospects for its growth, will put it in a position where it has to take larger responsibilities. Unlike Japan and Germany, it's not an ally. It can't simply say, look, Americans, you do the hard work, we'll make the money. So it's, in a sense, it has to play a larger role in shaping the world. And how it does it, I think that is the big question that Guha does not address. But I think his book is brilliant, and his critique, India should avoid great power aspirations, was something the Sonia Gandhi, the Congress Party, had largely approved. But there is that tradition that we are not like the classical Western powers. We are different. But I think that argument now, under Modi at least, has been won by the other side. India wants to be a power, and most people in the country seem to love that idea, for good or bad.
All right. This was wonderful. We'll check in again soon. James and Raha, thank you so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you for inviting me.